meditative. Okay, so it says preparing to live stream. So let's see.
I think it's live.
Great. So now let me just come back to
But you have
Zoom.
disappeared, Bante.
Have I? Okay,
You are now
okay.
a bee.
Let me just see how I can get back here. I'm pretty sure it's not impossible. There we are. Am I back on screen?
You are, Venerable.
Very good. So thank you for joining us here, Venerable Nisabho. And maybe I'll just start off with just a short read of your biography. So here with Ajahn Nisabho was born in San Francisco, California, and raised in Spokane, Washington. He was born to Buddhist parents and began to sit regularly at the age of 15. Uh, he went to college and after 2012 went to Thailand to stay with Ajahn and ordained as a bhikkhu in 2013. He spent years training in Thailand and also in Australia and other branch monasteries with very well-known and respected senior monks in the Ajahn Chah tradition, such as Ajahn, who we mentioned, and also Ajahn Jayasaro, Longpo Kalyano, and Ajahn Pasano, many of the great and highly respected teachers in the Ajahn Chah tradition. And Ajahn Nisabho invited me to appear on his podcast not long ago, I think about a month and a half ago. And we had a really nice conversation. And this is actually the first time on this particular channel that we've ever done an interview. And I'm really glad that Ajahn Nisabho is is the first one to join. So hoping to get today some of his insights into practice, especially some of the practical aspects of his path and how we can apply that to our path. So thank you for coming, Ajahn Nisabho. It's great to have you.
Bante, it's good to be here. I've really appreciated the conversation too, and just the teachings. I've been tuning into the channel for a while now, so.
Yeah, great. So first of all, I mean, we were chatting a little bit about just your path, and it sounds really interesting because I know for myself, when I first came to Buddhism, I didn't really know any other Buddhists. But you
Mhm.
grew up in a Buddhist household. And could you run us through a little bit about how you came to, say, like adopt your parents' practice of Buddhism, how it became your own, how you took that on,
Mm,
started to meditate, and really started to come into Buddhism as your own as a young man? It sounds like it started around 15. So.
yeah, thank you. Um, it's related to a larger question too, which we can get into. My parents were, like many sort of budding Buddhists in the US now and then, tuned into teachers like Jack Kornfield, and the Thich Nhat Hanh tradition, and these sort of insight, the first wave of insight teachers that came from Thailand and elsewhere, after, the 1980s or so. And I'm really grateful for what they gave me in that sense. They were very gentle with their faith, and I think we're just testing it out themselves a bit. They meditated. We had silent dinners once a week. It wasn't too deeply structured at first. But then when I was 15, I read Siddhartha, like many a burgeoning hippie. Have you read that, Bante?
I think I just skimmed portions.
Yeah,
Very
okay.
famous book, though.
It's actually not a very Buddhist book when you come down to it. But Hermann Hesse is there's something perennial and lasting about the way he articulates this kind of dichotomy. I think that a lot of young people touch when they're about 15 of choosing the route of the sensualist and exploring the world by reaching through it, and the route of the renunciant of exploring the world by reaching over it. Some sort of Jungian dichotomy. And so many people I find, read Siddhartha or Narcissus and Goldman when they're about 15. And a lot of monastics, I think that for many of them was one of their first kind of spiritual doorways. So I read him when I was 15, and the Christians call this a moment of grace when it's almost like for me, it felt like a footprint that was made for me, getting to step into it. And just this vision of the Buddha, however imperfectly articulated by Hermann Hesse, a German kind of author of the middle of the century, was really meaningful, where, you have this idea of like, maybe someday me, maybe. And I think there's something very powerful about that monastic aspiration that takes up residence in people. I think there's something archetypal about it. And I think most practitioners have it somewhere in their hearts, like maybe someday if things changed, or, my family somehow became a non-issue. And I think some people can think that the fact that that lives in them and they aren't able to be a monastic is somehow a betrayal of their true purpose or something, like, but for me, it's just an important almost symbol or lighthouse on the path for most practitioners, that image of themselves as a monastic, and just to kind of hold it in the palm and let it gather sunlight for the first few years of a practice. And then I find it often it will take up residence in that person's heart alongside many other lighthouses of duty and karma that they have to navigate too. But it's a pretty precious aspect of a lot of people's hearts, I think, when they touch Buddhism and sort of read about the path for the first time. So I started meditating with my parents then. I took on half an hour of meditation a day. And then when I was in just beginning college, one of my friends told me about a friend of his who had begun meditating an hour and a half a day, or 2 hours. And it was one of those moments where just something in you says, oh, I need to do that. And it gathered momentum in my life until by the end of college, I was meditating an hour and a half a day. And just the effect over 10 years or 9 years of daily practice had made it become very clear to me that was the most important thing in my life. And what I think is so interesting is my parents and I progressed on the path during that period together. We went on silent retreats, spoke about the Dharma. But when I stepped into monasticism, I grew up near Sarvasti Abbey near Spokane, Washington, one of the most flourishing communities of Tibetan Western convert monastics maybe in the West, actually, about 20 bhikkhunis and 4 bhikkhus. Pretty astounding, actually. Venerable Thupten Chodron is the abbess there. But when I stepped into robes of the Ajahn Chah tradition by going to Thailand and just intuiting that's, I needed to try this out, otherwise I would always wonder. And I think when you reach that point in your path, you just can't logic your way through it. Like intuition is karma, and there's something about the body's recognition of pattern that you just need to go to the monastery. And I went to Wat Pah Nanachat first, and it just seemed a bit too serious at the time for me. But then I went to Wat Mapjan, where Longpo Anan, another senior disciple of Ajahn Chah, known for his metta, for his resonance with the Mahayana, was living. And within about a few minutes of going there, he called me over across the kitchen, and across the sort of yard, and I kind of knew I wanted to ordain there that quickly. So my sense is when you're at that aspect, or that point in a path, you really need to go visit those places for the path to become clear. But I'll just finish by saying that how I think this is relevant to a larger discussion is my parents and I were the heirs of a wave of Buddhism in the US predicated on secular articulations that were in some sense a reaction to the Christian heritage so many were rebelling against, emphasizing the psychological, de-emphasizing the ritual, de-emphasizing the cosmology. And I think there's a new moment in Buddhism right now in the West that you, I'm sure, can speak to as well, Bhante, where there seems to be a true hunger for those exact aspects that were left out in the initial articulation. And my parents, when they started coming to the monastery in Thailand, began to develop a taste for that as well. And coming back to the West, 4 years ago from Thailand to live in Seattle, which is statistically the most secular city in the US, we really thought, you have these meditation groups, which are, the secular meditation groups in the US generally are sort of baby boomers and up. And we sort of really wondered when we came with these robes and this ritual, if we'd get any young people. And it's been the complete opposite. So many young people are somehow hungry for the form and the ancient container And whenever we at this sort of decision point of like, do we give a talk on asubha, like body contemplation, or just stick with loving kindness? It's so fascinating because every time we've gone into asubha or devas or ritual or the training, those are the kind of aspects of the teaching that seem to hit the most deeply right now. And it says something about this liminal moment, I think, in Western Buddhism, that's what is resonating. Theravada has teeth, and I think people really want, they want to be trained and asked something of. So really long answer, but there's a lot there, and I find it very interesting. So my parents are now just, they love being at the monastery. They just helped build a little hut down at Karuna Buddhist Vihara with the nuns there. They were just at Abhayagiri, and yeah, once you kind of go monastic and into those monastic circles, you don't really go back. I think it's
Well, I think
so.
you touched on some really interesting and relevant points there. I was reading through some of your newsletters about Clear Mountain, and
Mm,
it was striking to me how many people you were talking about who had come to practice with you and then wanted to ordain afterwards.
yeah.
And so, for people who are feeling this kind of struggle in their heart, and kind of should I stay or should I go?
Mm,
I think you spoke to something really important when you said that some of the karma is intuition and it's represented in the body. And
mhm,
for people who are practicing and trying to make that decision, how do they know it's the right one? And if they
mm.
feel it's the right one, how do they gather the courage to do it? And how did that play out in your case? Was it a difficult decision? Maybe you could speak to some of those things.
Yeah. Thank you, Bante. And I would like to hear your thoughts on kind of the liminal moment in Western Buddhism at some point in this discussion as well. Um, I think that you know this also. There's a very common theme in monastics' lives where, a young man or young woman will sort of come to you after encountering the Dharma and being like, all right, I'm selling everything and going to the monastery. I'm in this for life and I'm just going to go ordain. And pretty reliably, you can count on that not to actually play out exactly in that way. You know, the sort of robe fever. And something very true is being spoken to there, this love and desire to align one's life with Dhamma. But it's very rare that people can remain as monastics. Out of the large sample size of Buddhists that might have interest in that. And there's a seduction to large decisions and decision points where, it's easy to fixate on the decision like, can I just give up everything in my life or just go ordain? And so often the right advice is just go visit a monastery for a week. Like if you've never actually been to one, just do that, step one. Um, and often that's really enough, is if someone's visiting a monastery, an upasaka, this sort of ancient form of a lay practitioner. If they're visiting a monastery for about a week, 3 times a year, or even a long weekend 3 times a year, they might really find that actually honors the part of their heart that knows they need to align themselves more deeply with the path. And some of the hungers for a form that honors that intention. And I think Western Buddhism is just now maturing enough that we're beginning to be able to articulate the upasaka form more clearly for people, where, as a Western Buddhist, you don't have to lay practice, you don't have to sort of piece together this patchwork Dharma life from YouTube videos and Reddit threads. Like there is an ancient form you can step into that has been graced by some of the most profound hearts of the past 2,500 years. Chitta the householder was an anagami. Lady Visakha, Anathapindika, these were awakened beings at some level. So there's that, but I think also the acknowledgement that Western Buddhists find themselves in a very hard situation now. Ajahn Sona says it's like you have one foot on a banana peel and one foot in the monastery, where, it's like in Thailand, living near a monastery is just a huge help because you don't have to make this extreme decision of like renouncing all these worldly aspirations and becoming a monastic, or staying separated from the monastery and just sort of making do with your local meditation group once a week. You have the option of really, like, there's a huge swath of Thai population or Buddhist population that will go to the monastery 3 times a week or every day. And
Mhm.
I think that's the great missing ingredient in Western Buddhism right now. And it's why we're so interested in building a monastery in Seattle accessible to people in the city. In North America right now, so many of the monasteries are a 1 or 2 hour drive from large population center. And in Thailand, there's good monasteries within 20 minutes of most cities. And it's just, that's really needed. It's really needed. And so just for people to have compassion for themselves, trying to figure this one out, it's not an easy dilemma. And I think just some patience, ample use of YouTube and online communities helps a lot. Regular visits to the monastery.
Mhm.
If one does find that decision manifesting where you really are wondering if it's time to go to try, Paulo Coelho has a very powerful quote. He wrote The Alchemist, and by some accounts sold. There's some accounts of him making a deal with the devil or something to write a bestseller. It's a weird story, but this quote is great. He says, "When you're young, you know what you want, and then you forget. But life is kind, and it gives you a second chance. And then your choice is either to pay the price to live your own story, or to live the story of another, meaning your parents or your spouses, etc." And what I love there is the fact that when you're young, sometimes you actually do see the direction that your heart wants to go. And then you do forget, like college happens and things get all mixed up. But then very often you see this in people's lives, like a second coming of their vision and intuition kind of circles back around, but it has a price to it. And you have to make a sacrifice. We want to play chess and keep all our pawns. And to just acknowledge like there is a there's something to be stepped off of actually and given up. And I think that's important to know, but also that if you're practicing regularly, if you're just visiting monasteries, usually it won't be this big uncertain decision. It'll just be an inevitability. Um, so, that's my sense of it.
Yeah. And I think one of the things you said as well seemed very powerful to me, which was that, that there's something in your body that knows these things.
Yeah.
There's something in your body that is a connection to intuition. I remember when I was a young man thinking to ordain, it was actually a very difficult decision for me. And there was, one can almost feel like the body is pulling in one way and the rational faculty is pulling in another.
Mm,
And I've noticed in your writings actually that you emphasize quite a lot of faith. Like faith comes up as a theme quite often.
mm,
And how does one develop that faith to make these hard decisions or to make
mm.
decisions that one knows are right with the heart, but that might be a little bit difficult to wrap the head around?
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny. So many Western Buddhists these days and teachers really try to mitigate the impact of the word sara, which means to place the heart, by translating it just as confidence. And there's a place for that. Like Buddhist faith really can, the Buddha didn't ask you to declare this binary of belief at the beginning of the path, like so many of the great faiths of the world or the Abrahamic faiths do. Just even by the nature of them being called the great faiths, it has that kind of baked in, either Jesus Christ is your savior or he's not. And with Buddhism, it's a much more gentle progression where, the Buddha's saying, do you have faith that by giving up a lesser happiness for a greater is a worthwhile endeavor, is a working hypothesis, and that the mind can be brought to greater states of purity. But I really think, once again, it talks about this like liminal place I see a lot of Buddhism in the West, where actually something happens with faith that isn't embodied with the word confidence. It's a love. And faith in that sense of like an uplift of the heart is a huge and powerful tool and support on the path, and maybe one of the most powerful determiners of how someone's path will play out in terms of its ability to continue through a lot of difficulty. So I don't like tamping down the meaning all the time. Like I like to at least give both, Yes, it's confidence, but it's also this love of truth and the Buddha, this profound teacher. So I think beginning just with the aspects of the path which are often accessible to people. Reading the suttas, I think most practitioners should really try to make their way through the whole Sutta Pitaka. And if you're not the type of person that reads like one sutta a day, I'm a binger, so I just like stayed up really late for like every night for a month and just tried to read through all the suttas in one go, and it was a blast. And but knowing like what better use of your mind than to read the Buddha's words and try to do that in a life. And so leaning on those aspects of wisdom, seeing how things play out, doing 28 full-length prostrations every morning, that equals up to about 10,000 a year. That's a beautiful, just embodied act. Visiting monasteries, it is good to see arahants. But I'd say also just, yeah, letting, not shying away from that part of the heart that is falling in love with the path either. Like there's something very true there, and it's very important. And it's a shame to see it sterilized down to a language, to the lowest common denominator of language every time. It doesn't deserve that. So,
Yeah.
what are your thoughts on that, Bante?
Um, yeah, I mean, I think that it is a really important thing, and I think that you've touched on a lot of good points about the need for Western Buddhism to adopt some of these things that it initially ignored, like renunciation and faith. And without those things, a person's practice, it's difficult to make it go deep. I mean, if it's just
Mm,
going to be about
yeah.
being better at the job or getting a better relationship, which is how I started to.
Mm,
And I'm pretty curious. I'm curious as well about your experience in Thailand, because one of the pivotal points of my monastic life was actually when Ajahn sent me to Thailand. I remember there was a monk who came to Tisarana before I went to Thailand, and he had all this faith. He was he was
mm,
a he was a an academic before, but he'd come back and he was just the way he was talking was, oh, the Prabhupada said this and the Ajahn said that, and I was thinking, oh, I don't know if I'm going to fit in. I'm not that kind of faith type. So I
mm.
went to Thailand, and when I returned from Thailand, I was like, oh, the Prabhupada said this, and
Yeah, yeah,
I was
yeah.
the exact same way. And I just felt like it had this profound impact on my worldview, not just in terms of faith in people, but the Thai worldview is very different in terms of its way of looking at, say, like beings that we can't see
Mhm,
and
yeah.
their impact on our life. And the impact that karma has on our life, not just karma in terms of, I give something nice to somebody, so they give me a gift, but karma in terms of its more mysterious aspects.
Hmm.
So I'm just wondering if you could speak a little bit about whether that view impacted you as well, and how you bring some of these views that are there in Thailand that seem so much of a part of the Buddhist fabric of the country and of the society, and that seem to be a big contributor to the ease with which people practice there. How do you bring that to the West, and how has it influenced your practice?
Bante, I love the interview format, and I will answer that question, but I want you to answer it first because I want to hear your answer as well on this. If
Well,
I can turn it back, I'm
yeah,
really
sure.
curious.
So it's a dual interview. So,
Yeah, yeah.
um, yeah, well, I've been living in Sri Lanka for 6 years. So, I mean, I don't really have strong opinions about how to, bring things to the West or
Mm,
how to make it work in the West. But
mm,
I know that for myself, it really changed my perspective in terms of the care that I took, especially with things that I might not think would have like an immediate consequence, perhaps. Like I
yeah.
remember Ajahn Suripanya when we went into the forest in Dowdam, he was giving us all these pieces of advice, like, okay, if you got to urinate, don't go urinate at the base of any big trees. And,
Mm,
like when you're alone in the forest, essentially you've got to act like there's other people around because, there might be. You just
mm,
assume that there's beings around. And I remember they had this really big, huge tree at Dowdam. Did you ever visit that one? It's this
yeah,
massive
yeah.
tree. Yeah. So they built this campsite like right next to the tree, and there was a latrine and everything there. And then one day, this huge branch fell off the tree and just smashed the campsite, so you couldn't use it anymore. So that's kind of an image that stuck in my mind. Like, okay, you have to. And it was always something that we were warned about in Thailand talked about. I mean, you can take some of these natural events and assume that there might be a message perhaps behind them. I mean, you can't take every natural event like that, but I tend to think of things a little bit more in that way now. It's like, what kind of message is there in this particular thing that's happened for me now that, I might not be able to intuit just on a like A plus B equals C
Yeah.
type of formula. How about yourself, Venerable?
Yeah, thank you for that story. And it was fascinating. I was listening to a podcast on Jinn, and this sort of person who had sort of heritage in the Middle East, talking about the mythology around jinn there, and just the exact same thing around devas in trees. Like, jinn in trees do not like being urinated on, and they will make your life miserable if you do it. And I just found that, for me, it speaks to the world. We have such conceit in this sort of sterile Western worldview of a dry materialism that, like, this is, the most refined, logical view, but it's such an anomaly in the human kind of history of how people actually view the world for so much of history. And currently, the vast majority of the population of the world still believes in the unseen. And, it's interesting. The definition for me of scientific method is people independently, with the same tools, verifying a shared phenomena independently of one another. The lens through which we see the world is made up of experts. And with these phenomena, the technology, like a microscope, is this of samadhi in the mind. And it's just a technology the West has so let atrophy that it's always, in the West, seemed very haphazard. But in these cultures that have cultivated that technology as an art, as a science, it's not that same kind of haphazard approach. And you have the same, these well-practiced beings all speaking to the same kind of phenomena. So I found that very interesting. And yeah, just the care with which you begin to, it does soak into you in Thailand. I remember going, and someone was mentioning like devas, and I kind of made some offhanded comment about, oh yeah, I hear they're in the trees, and he's like, no, they are. They don't seem to like care about us so much. And I just, his matter of fact way of talking about it made me like do a double take. And within, it took some time, and I also really grounded that change in view by reading Dr. Ian Stevenson and the past life memories of children and verified accounts. Like, I feel like there's really good science behind this, actually. But just being around people who all believe it, spiritual friendship affects us quite deeply, and people's views do also. So yeah, I came away really open to it. And then you're right, like, people do have this conceit of it doesn't matter at all if you believe in rebirth. And I can say from holding both views, it really does. Like, it makes you take such care. And I remember I lived with Ajahn Kalyano for a while in Australia, and he had two health issues come up in subsequent years, and maybe one year when I was there, subsequent years. One, he had a huge boil or something in his back that he had to have removed. And another, I think it was some broken bone or something in his foot. And in both cases, he had a nimitta directly after the injury happened of, with the boil in his back, it was an image of when he was a child, a kid. He'd shot a bird far away with a BB gun, and it had sort of, I think it had either died or been seriously injured. And then something similar with the snake, or with the foot, where I think he'd like hit a snake with a club. And just the sense, like, we can have the image of like, oh, if we hurt an animal, it's not a big deal, right? But those karmic echoes can be quite powerful, actually. And then, recently, there's one teacher, you'll know this, and it's an interesting subject, but teachers in Thailand, sometimes it's hard to read them. I mean, most monasteries, disciples and most teachers will say, oh, my teacher's an enlightened being and he can read minds. But sometimes it's true. And sometimes they don't always behave like you think they would. There's a certain amount of, they're fascinating, colorful characters. And there's one monk who I had some doubt about, and I would sort of express it but I think he really may have been an arahant. And I was expressing my doubts somewhat public, like not with the sort of care that I might have. And I, we had someone in our community who really began to slander me very intensely and um, almost rip apart our budding community. And I had no idea what this karma was coming from. It just seemed so intense. And after a time of contemplating, I began to really think, I mean, who knows, but it felt like it could have been my speech towards an enlightened being and the effect that that karma was having. And something about that idea actually really felt true.
Mhm.
So I've been so much more careful in my speech ever since. I never want to create that karma again. And the karma that you create against an arahant is that will echo for a long time. And
Mhm.
yeah, just the power, like I was saying very small things, like quite appropriate from my perspective at the time, considering my doubts, but just the echo back or the boomerang effect was so profoundly intense. Yeah, I've always remembered that lesson too, like the branch of the tree hitting the campsite, you know? So
Right.
yeah.
Well, I mean, it's quite interesting as well, because there are these kind of approaches to meditation in which you ask questions during your meditation,
Mm,
and then for some people, these kind of unusual answers come up. So I know that one of the things that kind of comes up in discussion is, oh, karma is it's something that you can't contemplate. Only a Buddha can figure it out. But I think that you spoke to
mm,
something important there, and that
yeah.
people can get some intuitions, not necessarily of the whole picture of karma, but maybe what they might have done to give rise to a particular consequence. And that can be something really powerful.
And sometimes it's just silly, almost the equivalencies. Like I think there was just a few weeks ago, someone offered me a ticket to go see an exhibit somewhere. And literally, like an hour or so after he'd offered me the ticket, my parents had a spare ticket to like some music festival that he'd really wanted to go to. They couldn't go to it, and they just randomly offered it to him. Like it was just, you just see synchronicities like that that seem kind of absurd, um,
Mhm.
and give you some faith. You're right. And in terms of how to teach this stuff in the West, you know, I find the beauty of a chaotic system, which is what samsara is, idapachayata, that conditionality. An aspect of chaotic systems, as Ajahn has noted, is scale invariance, where a pattern that repeats at a small level repeats at every scale of, or almost every scale of view. So the pattern in a mind is also what repeats on the cosmos. And what it means is that whenever you speak to cosmology, um, yes, you can frame it, these are things the Buddha taught. There's fascinating wisdom hidden in them, but also just think of them as, for those who aren't on board with that whole thing, you can really frame it also as this is ways of conceiving of your mind. Are you in a hungry ghost mind state? What's the animal realm look like? And there's huge nuggets of wisdom in that kind of cosmology, like the asuras, the angry titans, basically. In fact, the Norse, I think, conceive their vision of Valhalla is almost certainly the Asura realm. Everyone goes out and fights all day, and then they come back and have a big feast. And interestingly, the Norse think that's heaven. And one mythological aspect of the Asuras is they think they're in heaven too. And just this aspect of the righteously angry mind that thinks it's kind of in heaven, or at least it's at the apex of becoming, like something about it seems so right. Um,
Mhm.
so that's just these little lessons you can tease out of the mythology that are very rich. And so I think with every such teaching, whether it be rebirth or dependent origination, and the 12 links do refer to a multi-life perspective. The Buddha is very clear on that. It's not just in the moment. But for every one of those teachings we give, you always, I find, frame it, give the equivalence for those who aren't on board with it. And there's always a lesson to be drawn there. So the daily life interpretation and the cosmological. But I would say it's kind of a shame to always neuter the cosmological interpretations because people are genuinely hungry for that. And yeah, Longpo Suchita says the Buddha has cosmology, we have psychology. And I think that's very, very interesting.
Yeah, you know, I think that one of the things traditionally that say like cosmology and faith in devas or faith in gods or whatever it might be, this kind of hidden side of practice would do, it seemed to go along with faith, and it seemed to help people deal with uncertainty.
Mm,
And oftentimes I think that would be, taken to mean that, it was untrue, it was false. It's like an opiate, something that blinds you and it helps
mm,
you deal with uncertainty, but the same way that a drug does. So, I mean, I was reading through some of your articles, and it seems, are you still going Pindapata? And you're going Pindapata the early days of that, maybe still doing, and just getting whatever people give you.
yeah,
And
yeah.
I know that for a lot of people in the West, anxiety about uncertain events in the future is something that causes quite a lot of suffering.
Mm,
And so, how can we, as people who are practicing, deal with these kind of uncertainties using the tools that the Buddha's given us, say like faith, these various things, cosmology, meditation? How can one take on these kind of very uncertain events, especially as a monk? You're going pindapata, you don't know if you're going to get food. I've read some of your tudong stories, you don't know where you're going to sleep. How can
mm,
people extrapolate some of these teachings and practices into their life when they say, I don't know how a test result's going to go for their health issue, or they don't know how a meeting's going to go. They're worried about losing their job, or they're worried about X, Y, and Z. Maybe you could speak a
mm.
little bit to that.
Yeah, thank you. I think there's a temptation when things are very uncertain, I think, to try to cast your gaze even farther to the horizon and really try to figure out the decision and the full landscape and get all the variables and just chewing over that. But interestingly, I find in times that are quite uncertain with um, the biggest decisions, the correct motion of the heart is the opposite. It's to pull it inwards and really pay attention to the tenor of a decision in the heart. Like, is this something that makes me feel strong or weak? Um, how kind is this decision? Is it something that feels rushed and hot, or something that feels kind of cool and settled? And the simile I think of there is, when the seas are really rough, the temptation is to look out to the horizon for the lighthouse. But if they're rough enough, then all you actually get to do is look at the next wave and try to steer into it. So counterintuitively, when things are very uncertain, I think really coming back and just paying attention to the heart as it is right now. And I think one of the difficulties is people don't always realize there's an agility required to approach the Four Noble Truths, where the third and fourth noble truth of peace and the path are very attractive. And when things are progressing nicely, it's easy to kind of ride that wave. But people don't always realize, like, you're going to get a nice mix of all four until awakening. And when those days or weeks or years of dukkha hit, the first and second noble truth of clinging, it's easy to not realize that your orientation towards practice sometimes has to take a very concrete shift, in a sense of, instead of kind of coasting along and practicing in a very enthusiastic faith-based way, there's has to be, often it helps to really have an acknowledgement of, okay, like, I'm in a dukkha period, and my directive now is not to react out of doubt, out of anger, but to kind of keep my head down, keep putting one foot in front of the other. I know what the next decision is, and to be humbled by that. I think the first and second noble truth are kind of the route to humility. And sometimes it's best conceived of not you kind of working on suffering, but letting the suffering, if it's held correctly. This poetic language can be problematic, as many know, as you've spoken to as well. Buddhist romanticism is a problem, but there's also a power to the language if used as a skillful means of, like, letting the dukkha work on you and wash away your rough edges a bit. And there's a way of holding your difficulty like that and being humbled by it and not reacting, and just being like, this really hurts. This is quite painful. And yeah, I think when things are very doubtful, the temptation is to jump into action, and often the right decision is just to pay attention to the heart, hold it as a chance to learn from suffering and the need for certainty. And Longpo Munindo says the measure of one's practice is not lack of tension or just peace always, but rather the ability to hold tension with equanimity. I think that only applies to some extent. I think someday, peace really is a good metric, especially at Nibbana, but there's something to what he's saying, certainly. So,
Mm, yeah,
yeah,
thank you.
all that out there.
And I think that just speaking to what you said at the very end, that there is something to be said for equanimity, holding things, but having these kind of higher goals. And
Mm.
I was reading. I remember one of your emails. I think more than once actually we've talked. You said that there was a pivotal point in your practice where you realized that you were drying up inside without a creative outlet, like without a way to
Yeah,
express
yeah,
yourself creatively.
yeah.
And oftentimes I speak about meditation techniques. Okay, if you just feel like you've got the whole path laid out, that's not very good. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more to that insight that you had and how we can use creativity on our path to move forward towards these higher goals.
Thank you, Monte, for asking that one. I find that the metrics I found very useful with Theravada practitioners in the West. In the East, you're right, often people's practices are buoyed by faith in giving. There's a lot of that. In the West, because it's often dry, intellectual, and because of the kind of karmic heritage of us in Judeo-Christian cultures with self-critical inheritance from a consumerist upbringing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think people can really lean into renunciation to a fault. They want to align their lives with Dhamma, and the only way they know to do that is to double down again and again on cutting off, on pushing back, on pulling in. And you and I, I'm sure, have seen that get really weird at monasteries very often. And it's kind of a necessary limit to find for oneself. But I think a very good metric for Western practitioners is flourishing normalcy and warmth. Flourishing normalcy and warmth as part of one's practice. I've seen that as a very healthy thing to aim for. People can get very weird in the service of being good spiritual practitioners. And what I've also seen is, Freud articulated two basic instincts: eros, which is the desire to move towards creation, and thanatos, which is the death instinct, which is aggressive, kind of deadening, and often instantiates as a superego towards oneself of cutting off more. And what I've seen is people pouring their faith or their desire for Dharma into Thanatos again and again, more renunciation. And you just start to see the brittleness manifest in people and a certain dryness. There are four archetypes that are articulated in certain systems around the masculine. There's the king, the warrior, the magician, and the lover. And I think the Theravada is great for kings and warriors, at least the monastic circles we run in. Longpo Sumedho is very kingly. Warriors, Ajahn Mun, very warriorish. And for some people, that's enough. You just push, you kind of find your wall and you push against it, and there's a real joy in the renunciation, which I have too, obviously. We're a mix of all these. But our monastic circles and a lot of our Theravada articulation, I think, is just really not amenable yet to magicians and lovers, or that part of each of us. So the magician loves to play with knowledge, and many of our monasteries, it's can be hugely helpful to have some study and to read the Buddha's words and have that kind of nourished and encouraged to some extent. And I think that's something a lot of people can get a lot of joy from and nourishment. Ajahn Kovilo is a magician. Lovers, I find, are the most neglected in our tradition. The lover's prime directive, and this part in each person, is communion with the world. And the lover is the artist, and the lover's shadow is the addict. So instead of kind of blessing the world, it's this feeding off of the world. And yeah, I find for that part of people, there's an aspect of when you ordain or when you step into these renunciant paths, as a lay person or a monastic, you're cutting off so many roots your heart has had towards happiness that you have to find ways of replacing that. And that directive to have some communion with the world through genuine love, I find one of the most powerful roots to that for many, including myself, is art. The Christian monastics, they lack our meditative tools, many of them do, but they do have art. And a lot of senior monastics have some part of this in their lives. Like Ajahn Sucitto writes poetry and draws. Ajahn Amaro writes all the time. Ajahn Viradamo, weaves. And, you know, Ajahn Abhinando writes poetry. It's very common. There's some little part of that in someone's life. And I just think it's a beautiful way of rejoicing. And I think art can be used beautifully in the service of the first and third noble truth, either to metabolize suffering, and let go of it, or to honor and call forth and circle around. Calling it the divine is problematic in a Buddhist sense, but whatever the third noble truth is resonant with, that aspect of the heart that's pure and radiant, and somehow having some way of circling around that for people and invoking it, I think is really significant for practitioners. So I found that to be the case with myself. And I think it's a good practice is people keeping some art in their lives, even just once a month, writing or drawing or something. I find it to be very nourishing and keeps the heart alive. Like many monastics will disrobe after a few years, and often sensual desire is the proximate cause, but my sense is the real deepest cause is just the heart becoming dry. So a long answer, Bhante. I'm curious how
Yeah,
any of that
thank you.
resonates with
Thank you
you.
for the answer. And I just want to read a quote that you'd sent in a recent email. Of Emerson's three transcendentals, truth, goodness, and beauty, we could
Mm,
stand to cultivate more expressions of the third.
yeah. That's a beautiful truth, goodness, and beauty. Yeah, Emerson articulated those, and they've been articulated through history actually in different forms. There's resonance with the Trinity, with the Triple Gem, and more. But yeah, truth, goodness, and beauty. We have so much truth and goodness, but I think Western Buddhism could use a little more invocation of the beautiful. So,
Hmm.
yeah.
And so we're getting close to the end of the hour, and I'd like to get some of your insights into meditation, just jumping off of
Mm,
what we were just talking about, truth, goodness, and beauty, and creativity. Um, I'm curious to know, how has your approach to meditation changed? And how are you practicing now? Like in terms of, did you start off with a particular like technique and way, and then it evolved?
mm,
Um, or did you just kind of try to find your way? Because the Buddha's given so many different topics of meditation, so many different ways to approach it. And there's so many different ways in which it needs to find expression in our life in
mm,
order for it to be successful. And we kind of can practice metta on the cushion. If we don't express that outwardly, if we get angry still outwardly, then it's not useful. So I'm just curious if you could share a little bit about your path, your meditative path specifically, your practice path specifically, how it's evolved, and maybe a little bit of advice for people who are also trying to find their way in their own
mm. This one I will be curious about your take on as well, Bhante. Um,
path.
just to say that, yeah, it's quite an intimidating smorgasbord of technique out there. And, one thing is there's an attraction to those systems which are very clear, like Pa'ok or Goenka on technique. Um, One beauty of the Thai forest tradition and perhaps the Sri Lankan to some extent is on the outside it looks more rigid, but because its identity is held and framed by the form, by ritual, by history, the meditative freedom within it is actually profound. Whereas more modern secular techniques such as Mahasi or Goenka or Pa'ok Pa'ak less so perhaps, but because their identity is predicated on the technique, there's a rigidity, almost a necessary rigidity to maintain that identity. I mean, if you go to a Goenka retreat, you agree to practice the Goenka technique.
Mm-hmm.
So that fluidity at the heart of the Thai forest tradition is actually a precious thing, and it can be a lot. So I'd say that I began, as many have, I think, with breath. And, I also, you try out a lot of different clothes. You try metta practice, death contemplation, and others. The sense for myself is loving kindness practice as an explicit practice, or death. These are all just sanya. They're very explicit perceptions predicated largely or catalyzed by vitaka vichara. And I just find the kilesas catch on really fast. Like a metta phrase will work for a week or two and then it stops. And um, for me, I really take the heart. The Buddha is saying the anapanasati, the breath meditation, was the abode of the Tathagata. It was his home. And it's such a nourishing practice that taps into the bodily energies in a way that I think is very hard with practices like just invoking pure awareness, or I've never known what that even means. Honestly, I have a lot of trouble on tapping into that. I know you have a whole thing on that, Bhante Joe, and I've appreciated it actually. But you know, so the breath meditation is great. And the problem with breath meditation, as it's been taught, there's a great book called The Experience of Samadhi by Richard Shankman, where he really analyzes how breath meditation from this very holistic, full-bodied approach, which I think is pretty evidenced in the Anapanasati Sutta and the suttas, gets narrowed through the Visuddhimagga, of which I also know you have opinions, Bhante, into um, you know, into this sort of narrow pigeonhole that the Kasinas sort of made out, and really focusing on just one single point, and that's it. And for Ajahn Lee said people either are the type that think a lot or don't think that much. And for those that don't think often or don't really have a lot of vitaka, vichara, a single point can be really useful. And for I think many of the Thai Ajahns of the last century, that was very accessible. I mean, they grew up weaving baskets for hours or farming. Like their samadhi was just very good. But for moderns, whether from the East or the West now, I think our thinking minds are very, overly developed probably, and you have to work with that. And so I find what's called sutta jhana now, the breath meditation, thinking of the breath as a full-bodied experience, invoking the breath energies, pana, prana, chi, and working with that as a skill, is actually very effective for many Westerners, I found. And I think that's being most effectively taught by Ajahn Thanissaro, Ajahn Jeff, and Ajahn Sucitto. I think they're two sides of the same coin. I think Ajahn Sucitto's the bard, Ajahn Jeff's the engineer. Ajahn Jeff's just trying to get us to play our scales, and Ajahn Sucitto's kind of over here playing a symphony. But they're both speaking to the same thing, and I found that to be a game changer. Absolutely saved my practice, and I think saved a lot of Westerner practices I know. I found that I really needed to work with those breath energies, needed to invoke a bit of qigong. There's a practice called the Way of Energy, or a book which really invokes these 5 standing poses. And then honestly, cold water is so helpful. It is a skillful means that it's easily accessible for people unless you live in Australia or Sri Lanka, Bhante, sorry.
It's still
But
there.
yes, well, Sydney's freezing actually. I lived in a really badly insulated hut there for a winter, so I know. But yeah, cold water will brighten and clarify the breath energy. Pretty amazing, as will exercise. But yeah, I found that to be very helpful. And then after a while, I think you get the sense too, you just stop needing to ask questions very often of meditation teachers, because you know what your practice is. And for me, it's really finding a way to work with and refine that natural breath energy flow. And you know, there's a great symbiosis between the different breath energy systems of like Kundalini and Qigong. But the Chinese, I think, have refined their articulation of the breath body to, the level of quantum mechanics. They're so good at it. And the microcosmic orbit, I think, is such a good paradigm for how that should flow into clarity. Um, so yeah, for me, I kind of circulate awareness, work with the different flavors of breath energy. In Chinese, there's Jing, which is a very earthy energy. I find that resonant with the lower chamber and somewhat resonant with the first foundation of Kayanupassana. There's Qi, which I sort of in the middle chamber of the body, resonant with Vedanupassana a bit. And then there's Shen, which is sort of the mind, this upper chamber, a very heavenly, sweet energy, somewhat resonant with Chitanupassana. It's an interesting little parallel. So I'll move through those flavors of piti, actually. I think they're rapture. And then after you get this clear circuit going, it's like a circuit creates a still magnetic field. And I think that's where stillness can come from in some of these conceptions. And the final thing I'll say is that the sound of silence is a very powerful tool that I think people should use, especially if you utilize breath meditation. It pairs very well. And I've heard someone say it's the sound of chi, and I think that's not inaccurate somehow. So the sound of silence, the subtle hissing below the auditory landscape, it clarifies, brightens, where breath meditation often calms and settles. And they're just perfect, companions. So I find that useful. I think if people are coming up against a wall, I see a dangerous narrative in a lot of people's practice where they're just like, if I just keep doing this one technique, eventually something will pop and I'll get there. And I think that's a very bad narrative. I think, practice should be engaged. Alice Gopnik, this psychologist from Berkeley, researched the different brain scans associated with different ways of focus. And there's spotlight focus, which is much like, focusing on the tip of the nose. There's lantern focus, which is more temporal, seeing just what comes up in any given moment. But and I find many articulations of practice swing between those two, like focus or complete release. But there's a third kind of activity of the mind that she noted that has a completely different read on brain scans, and it's play awareness. It's playful. That's a good ethos for meditation. Like, how are you involved and interested and have some chanda and invoke and play with your meditation such that you can really develop it as a skill that's of interest. So another long answer.
Yeah, thank
What
you.
about you, Bante? Let me turn that on you before things wrap up.
Well,
What are your
I don't want to be the last one to answer, so in that case, maybe I could ask you another question.
Sure, sure,
No,
sure.
I mean, just resonating with what you said. I think it is really important to have creativity in a person's meditation practice. I started in the Zen tradition. I'm very grateful for that. And it was quite technique oriented. You couldn't close your eyes. I would sometimes sneak and close my eyes on retreats. You get yelled at, open your eyes. Kind of and it's very specific the way that you had to meditate. And it was very helpful at the beginning. But I think that to deal with the various defilements that comes up, one needs to be creative. I mean, I used to take martial arts and Taekwondo, and you start with these very formulaic ways of punching and kicking. And if you try to do that in a fight, I mean, maybe you'd hit a guy who like never fought before. But if you do it once or twice, he's going to figure it pretty quick. There's a really clear telegraph, like you put your hands up and you turn them in a particular way. And I remember as I was going for my black belt, about to go for my black belt test, the black belt instructor, he said, when you're sparring as a black belt, your blocks change from this really big articulation to just like this. Just a quick movement of your hand, like it almost looks like nothing. And your punches change from this, and again, a very clear, almost telegraph movement in your forms to, it can just be like this very quick thing in which you would use to strike another person. And yet the technique is still there. It's still behind that creativity. The foundations are still there. So resonating with what you said, and I think it speaks to also what you were saying about the importance of creativity on a person's path. Can brighten their life in various ways, and it can also spill over into their meditation technique.
Yeah.
So maybe, oh, sorry, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I agree. And just interesting random thought popped in my head that I found very interesting is Ajahn Jeff associates the Paranimita Vasawati Devas, those who delight in the creations of others, with the Greek muses. And I always thought that was an awesome little Ajahn Jeff gem I found in one discourse, and I was like, well, that's really fascinating. So
That is fascinating. It
yeah,
could
I
be.
thought that was pretty cool. So
And so maybe if you'll allow me, we're just a little bit over
please,
time, but I'll
no, no, no
just want to get
worries.
one more question in there to try to get your insights. So I know for a lot of people, one of my personal insights, especially in the modern day, and vibing with what you said about the West now turning towards the more renunciant aspects, maybe the more faith-based aspects of things that have been left out. One of the things that really interests me is why in the Buddha's time were there so many lay practitioners who were well attained compared to the time now? And
Hmm.
I mean, I have the good fortune to meet many lay people who are very serious practitioners. Some of them decide not to have children so they have more time to practice, right?
Hmm.
Some of them like structure their jobs so that they have more time to practice.
Hmm.
And yet there's this balance that is difficult to strike between, say, like the need for pulling back and being in solitude in order to nurture one's meditation practice, and also the need to be engaged in the world. And just thinking about your project that you're doing right now with Clear Mountain. I remember we were chatting the last time before the interview, and when I was listening to you and Ajahn Kovalo talk, I was like, "Oh, so are you guys going to build a hermitage? Or are you going to what's it going to be? And how many cookies are you going to build?" Ajahn Kovalo said, "It's a nice forest, and we want to keep it that way." So I got this impression that, at least as we talk now, it's going to be something that might start with, you know, some simple conditions, some good solitude, and then potentially evolve. And so it seems like a balance that even monastics need to try to strike in our aspiration for the highest goal, in which solitude is important, in which renunciation is important, in which finding time for oneself to practice seriously is important. We also live in a world in which we need to be engaged. And so you've spoken a little bit about breath meditation and using it for these goals that people really want to achieve, like jhanas or whatever it might be. How can we strike this balance? Maybe you could speak a little bit to yourself, but also for these very serious lay people who want to reach the noble attainments, who want to have the jhanas, and are doing everything they can, but are also trying to strike this very difficult balance between renunciation and solitude and engagement in the world.
Yeah, thank you. I would say that it's a fascinating dichotomy because you're right, like on one level we could present the vision of Clear Mountain as that, it's a forest, it's a monastery, we want time and seclusion. On the other hand, as we were speaking about right before the Zoom session, we're hoping and on the Zoom session, 30, 35 minutes from the city so that people can actually visit. We already have such a flourishing lay community, I suspect and hope that people can come in great numbers to be there and find refuge. And my heart really brightens at that thought in a good way. Um, and but then we can kind of the monks can retreat through the back door. We talked about having kind of this metaphorical fireman's pole to sort of escape, not actually, but the sense of just the Theravada exit of escaping once it's time. And I just find them so mutually supportive. And it's interesting because people in the West generally, as dedicated practitioners, have focused on retreat. That's been the model. And how many retreats can I go on? And almost completely, when people ask these days, me, what can I do to deepen my practice? I'll just go to a monastery. Like, you don't need another retreat. You don't. And I've just seen monasteries as more powerful to people's hearts, just significantly. The alchemy that happens in a monastery, a good one, and the thing is, a monastery often has a mix. Like, you are working in the morning a bit, you're with people, and then in the afternoon you have space. And so I see that as really key, touching into that sort of Buddhist community. And I think some of the kind of fixation and intense metrics of I need jhana, how far can I get, is the condensation and myopic kind of closing of vision, tunnel vision around the eighth factor of the Noble Eightfold Path of right samadhi. But there's another seven and factors. And if people can step into build a Buddhist life which is holistic, which involves really beautiful Kali and Amitta, these structures of faith, then the pressure on the samadhi is less. And then, ironically, the samadhi can actually happen much more easily. That being said, I do think retreat's actually really important. And, as a monastic, I love the fact that, we go for alms and get to talk with people, but then we get to run away and be at our kuti. And then much of the year, we're going to Saturday gatherings and talking to people and building community. But then 4 months of the year, we're on deep retreat, at least four. Usually we try for 4.5 or so. And so I think that really is important for people to keep that balance. But just to note that if like most Western practitioners, someone's dedicated practice has relied on retreat model to ante up every time, often I find that's a path of diminishing returns if it's not supplemented by this holistic stepping into like a monastery or community too. And for a lay practitioner, I just think really emphasizing the upasaka form as you do want spiritual community, going to monasteries 3 times a year, but going on retreat as well. Taking 1 day a week and having that be your uposatha day where you hold 8 precepts and just have the afternoon as yours. But maybe in the morning, also inviting people over, Kali Nimitta, for brunch and feeding them. Like for Western practitioners who live such a siloed, isolated existence in this day and age, often that feeding other people a meal I see is pretty on par with the importance of taking 1 day a week for a long meditation session. Just do both. They're both part of this path. And so yeah, I think there really is a place for that seclusion. You need it. Your meditation practice will lose its interest and invigoration if you're not taking time in seclusion. But I would emphasize in a way I see underemphasized in the West right now, the importance of being with people and giving. Dana is the first paramita listed in the list of 10, and its rough synonym, chaga, relinquishment, giving up, is literally a synonym for nibbana. So giving is part of the path from the beginning to the end, and I think I wish people would understand and embody that and rejoice in it more. So, yeah.
Thank you for that, Venerable. And thank you for sharing your insights with us today. It's been great to hear and inspiring to hear about your path of practice, how it's evolved, and also to get these very practical pieces of advice that people can use in their daily lives, in their practice. So I think I've got more to ask you, but maybe we're running out of time. So hopefully you'll be kind enough to come on some other time and share more of your insights. So thank you again, Venerable. This is Ajahn Nisabho from Clear Mountain Monastery, and I think his work needs no introduction, but they have an excellent YouTube channel at Clear Mountain Monastery Project, and also their website, www.clearmountainmonastery.org, shares a lot of information about their many different meetings and gatherings in which you can connect with the community and Ajahn Nisabho and hear more of his teachings. So I think that on that note, end it there. Do you have anything final that you'd like to say, Venerable?
Just, I really, I think we connected initially a few years ago through Fourth Messenger based on your living with Moli, or no?
Nyanadeepa Bhante.
Yeah, Nyanadeepa. I get the jnanas mixed up so often, I'm sorry.
Yes.
There's so many jnanas. But yeah, since then we reconnected around these, getting to speak a few months ago, and just there's something very interesting happening with this kind of new younger generation of monastics that's kind of growing up and trying to articulate a vision of Dharma which really resonates with us, but also working in the modern medium. The Buddhists said to speak the vernacular of the land you're in, and to some extent, YouTube and all these things are part of that. But just feeling a lot of resonance with what you're doing, Bante, and I've loved your channel and yeah, your kind of insight into the different aspects of history in Buddhism and just a lot of resonance with how you're navigating. So thanks for having me on, and yeah, hopefully it's the first of many meetings. So.
Great. Thanks again, Nisabho. Ajahn Nisabho. Okay. Take care, everybody. Bye for now.